In the heart of London, nestled between the grand architecture of Mayfair's most prestigious streets, stood La Maison d'Or, a restaurant synonymous with luxury, exclusivity, and prestige. Owned by Arthur Coleman, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance, La Maison d'Or was more than just a restaurant. It was a temple of elitism, where only those he deemed worthy were allowed to dine. Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started. Arthur had spent decades crafting an image of perfection, an illusion he guarded obsessively. His staff was meticulously trained, not just in serving food, but in ensuring only the right kind of clientele entered his establishment. The decor was flawless, a blend of old-world elegance and modern luxury, untouched by the common world. And most importantly, the guests were carefully curated, not just by wealth, but by an unwritten set of standards that Arthur never spoke aloud, but enforced without mercy. Arthur believed La Maison d'Or was not just a place to eat, it was a status symbol. And then, on a seemingly ordinary evening, a reservation was made that would challenge everything he stood for. Jonathan Carter was a man of power and intellect, a self-made entrepreneur whose name carried weight in London's financial circles. Refined, intelligent, and exuding quiet confidence, Jonathan wasn't just another wealthy man. He was a force to be reckoned with. Despite his immense success, he had never been one to flaunt his wealth. His presence spoke for itself. That evening, he wasn't at La Maison d'Or for business. He was there to celebrate his 12th wedding anniversary with his wife, Sophia. But what Arthur Coleman didn't know was that Jonathan's visit wasn't just about a romantic evening. Jonathan was also evaluating the restaurant because he was considering buying it. Sophia Carter was the epitome of grace and intelligence. Sharp, confident, and effortlessly elegant, she was the kind of woman who could silence a room with just her presence. She knew how to read people, how to navigate high society without ever losing herself. From the moment she and Jonathan stepped inside La Maison d'Or, she felt it, the subtle, unspoken hostility. The way the maître hesitated just a second too long before acknowledging their presence. The fleeting glances exchanged between waitstaff. The stiffness in Arthur Coleman's expression when he saw them approach. She had seen this before, the kind of elitism disguised as refinement, the kind of exclusivity built on silent discrimination. But Sophia wasn't the type to react emotionally. She chose to handle it with poise. As they were led to their table, a lesser one near the entrance, despite the empty prime spots inside, she exchanged a knowing glance with Jonathan. They both knew exactly what was happening. Arthur Coleman believed La Maison d'Or was his fortress, his perfect kingdom, where he controlled who belonged and who didn't. He had no idea that he was about to lose everything. Arthur Coleman had seen countless wealthy guests walk through the grand entrance of La Maison d'Or, but the moment Jonathan and Sophia Carter stepped inside, something in him shifted uneasily. It wasn't their wealth. He knew exactly who Jonathan Carter was. A high-profile entrepreneur, a man with influence, money, and a reputation for making bold business moves. No, it wasn't their status. It was their presence. It was the way Jonathan carried himself, not with arrogance, but with effortless confidence. It was the way Sophia walked beside him, poised and commanding respect without saying a word. And most of all, it was the fact that they were not the kind of people Arthur wanted in his restaurant. Arthur prided himself on maintaining absolute control over La Maison d'Or. Everything, from the decor to the clientele, was carefully curated. And so, when he saw Jonathan and Sophia standing at the maître's podium, he made a decision. Put them at table 17, table 7 by the kitchen doors. A spot normally reserved for last-minute walk-ins, far from the picturesque ambiance of the main dining room. It was a calculated move, a subtle way of saying, "You don't belong here." The maître hesitated. He knew this was an insult, but under Arthur's rule, no one questioned orders. And so Jonathan and Sophia were led past the elegantly set tables, past the grand chandeliers, and seated next to the swinging kitchen doors, the lowest seat of the house. A different kind of service. From the very beginning, it was clear the service was different for them. Other tables were promptly greeted with warm smiles and champagne menus. Jonathan and Sophia, however, were barely acknowledged. Their server, a tall, stiff man in a pressed white uniform, walked over without enthusiasm. No welcome, no pleasantries, just a cold professional recitation of the specials. Jonathan remained composed, listening attentively, while Sophia simply nodded, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The way the waitstaff barely looked at them. The way their orders took longer than those at surrounding tables. The way Arthur himself stood in the background, observing them, waiting for something to justify his prejudice. He wanted them to flinch, to become agitated, to demand better service, because then he could say, "You see? They don't belong here." But Jonathan and Sophia did none of that. They did not complain. They did not react. They simply carried themselves with quiet dignity. Arthur's growing irritation. As the evening progressed, Arthur's irritation only grew. Jonathan was effortlessly charming. He treated every interaction with grace, speaking politely, unfazed by the service delays. Sophia was equally composed. She moved with poise, her expressions neutral, but her gaze sharp, as if she was cataloging every slight against them. Arthur found himself watching them obsessively. They weren't leaving in frustration. They weren't lowering their voices in discomfort. They weren't playing into the role he had expected. They weren't weak. And that bothered him deeply. He had designed La Maison d'Or as a place where he controlled everything, especially the kind of people who were allowed to feel comfortable. But Jonathan and Sophia weren't following his script. They weren't supposed to sit so confidently in a space he had deemed unworthy of them. They weren't supposed to exist in this restaurant as equals, but here they were, unshaken, unbothered, and completely in control of themselves. Arthur clenched his jaw. But something told him they weren't going anywhere. Arthur Coleman couldn't take it anymore. For the past hour, he had watched Jonathan and Sophia Carter sit in his restaurant, carrying themselves with the kind of confidence he despised seeing in people like them. They were supposed to feel out of place. They were supposed to shrink under his carefully constructed hostility. They were supposed to leave in embarrassment. But instead, they remained poised, unfazed, and dignified. Arthur prided himself on controlling everything in La Maison d'Or, the experience, the atmosphere, and most of all, the people. But tonight, he had no control, and that infuriated him. With a forced smile, Arthur smoothed his tailored jacket and made his toward table 17. The kitchen doors swung behind him. The soft chatter of the restaurant seemed to hush slightly. The waitstaff looked on nervously. Jonathan and Sophia noticed him approach, but neither of them looked intimidated. They knew exactly what was coming. Arthur rested his hands on the back of an empty chair and tilted his head slightly, his voice coated in false politeness. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I do hope you're enjoying your evening." Jonathan placed his glass of wine down gently. "We are, Mr. Coleman, though I must say the service is rather different from what I expected." Sophia raised an eyebrow but remained silent, letting the men play their game. Arthur's lips twitched in irritation, but he kept his tone measured. "Yes, well, you must understand. La Maison d'Or caters to a very particular clientele. We uphold a certain standard." Jonathan: "Oh, and what standard is that exactly?" Arthur smirked slightly, leaning in. "Our restaurant has always been a place for discerning guests, those who truly understand the culture of fine dining. I'm just not entirely sure this is the right environment for you." There it was, the thinly veiled insult, the carefully crafted condescension. He was telling them they didn't belong. Sophia finally spoke, her voice as smooth as silk. "How fascinating. Tell me, Mr. Coleman, exactly what part of our presence doesn't fit into your very particular establishment." Arthur's patience snapped, his mask of civility cracked, his frustration boiled over. "Let's not play games. You don't belong here. This restaurant isn't for people like you. I'm sure there are plenty of other places in London where you'd feel more comfortable. I'm asking you to leave." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A nearby waiter gasped. Other patrons subtly turned their heads, sensing the tension. The restaurant for a brief moment fell completely silent. Jonathan slowly leaned back in his chair, studying Arthur as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Fascinating," he murmured. Sophia exhaled lightly, shaking her head as if she had expected nothing less. Without another word, Jonathan took out his wallet, placed a generous tip on the table, and stood up. "Well then, we wouldn't want to disrupt the standards of this fine establishment." Sophia stood beside him, adjusting the hem of her evening dress before looking Arthur directly in the eye. "You should be careful, Mr. Coleman. People have a way of revealing their true nature, and sooner or later, you'll regret it." Jonathan gave Arthur one last, unreadable glance before guiding his wife toward the exit. They didn't shout, they didn't cause a scene, they didn't give Arthur the satisfaction of a reaction. They simply left. But Arthur Coleman had the strangest feeling that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. For days after the incident at La Maison d'Or, Arthur Coleman couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease. Sure, he had kicked them out. Jonathan and Sophia Carter had no place in his restaurant, and he had made that abundantly clear. So why did he feel as if he had lost? He told himself they were just another couple, that their presence had been a mere anomaly, nothing more. Then came the letter. A formal invitation from one of London's most prestigious law firms. A potential investor was interested in acquiring La Maison d'Or. Arthur's mood instantly lifted. This was his chance. A golden opportunity. For years he had considered selling, but only if the price was right. If this investor was willing to pay top dollar, Arthur could finally retire, wealthier than ever, leaving the restaurant world on his own terms. It was almost too perfect, and so, with renewed confidence, Arthur donned his best suit, polished his watch, and headed to the meeting that would change everything. The meeting that changed everything. The law firm's office was as grand as he expected. High-rise views, marble floors, and a receptionist who greeted him by name. "Mr. Coleman, they're expecting you. Please follow me." Arthur straightened his tie and walked in with the air of a man in control. Whoever this investor was, he would dictate the terms. He would name his price. And they would take it or leave it. As he stepped into the private conference room, he extended his hand out in greeting, and then froze. Sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table, perfectly poised, were two familiar figures. Jonathan and Sophia Carter. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt something he never expected. Panic. Sophia's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Jonathan, calm as ever, gestured to the chair across from them. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Coleman." Arthur's legs moved on their own, but his mind was racing. This isn't possible. They were supposed to be gone, forgotten. They were not supposed to be sitting here across from him controlling this meeting. He finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual sharpness. "What is this?" Sophia leaned back slightly, resting her hands elegantly on the table. "A business opportunity. One you should listen to carefully." Jonathan tapped a folder sitting before him. "We've been watching La Maison d'Or for some time, evaluating it as a potential investment. After our last visit, we made the decision to acquire it." Arthur's fingers clenched into fists under the table. They had planned this? They had been interested in his restaurant all along? His own arrogance had blinded him. Instead of seeing them as potential buyers, he had seen them as unworthy intruders, and he had thrown them out like garbage. Now, they were here to take everything from him. Arthur swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay even. La Maison d'Or is not for sale. Jonathan's expression didn't change. Everything has a price. Sophia tilted her head, eyes gleaming with polite amusement. Though, given the recent controversy surrounding the restaurant, its valuation may not be as high as you think. What controversy? Jonathan slid a newspaper across the table. The headline made Arthur's stomach drop. Racial discrimination allegations at London's most exclusive restaurant. Owner of La Maison d'Or faces backlash after high-profile guests expelled without cause. Arthur's mouth went dry. The media had gotten hold of the story. His precious reputation was already crumbling, and Jonathan and Sophia knew it. They hadn't just come to buy his restaurant, they had come to watch him fall. Arthur clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain composed. What exactly are you offering? Sophia smiled. A generous buyout, enough for you to walk away with dignity. Or Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to feel like a warning. You can refuse and watch your empire collapse. Arthur had never felt so trapped. For years, he had dictated the rules, deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now, Jonathan and Sophia were the ones deciding his fate. And they were doing it with the same poise and control he had tried to strip from them. Arthur's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no choice. He had to sell. And he hated that he had to say it. What's your offer? Jonathan smiled. Now we're talking. Arthur Coleman had built an empire, one that had stood for decades as a symbol of exclusivity, refinement, and wealth. But tonight, sitting across from Jonathan and Sophia Carter, he realized something horrifying. He had lost everything. And the worst part, he had done it to himself. Jonathan slid the purchase contract across the table, his expression as calm as ever. We're offering you a very generous price, Mr. Coleman, far above what your restaurant chain is currently worth. A high price, more than Arthur could have dreamed of making in a normal sale. Enough to disappear, to retire comfortably, but at a cost. Sophia spoke next, her voice smooth and controlled. But before you sign, there are 3 conditions. Arthur stiffened. He hated being dictated to. 1, you leave this industry for good. No more restaurants, no involvement in the culinary world ever again. Arthur's fingers curled into a fist beneath the table. 2, you don't speak a word about this sale to the public. No interviews, no statements. You disappear. Arthur's clenched. And 3, you do not, under any circumstances, open a competing restaurant. Not here. Not anywhere. Arthur's face turned red with anger. You're asking me to walk away from everything I built. Jonathan smiled slightly, leaning back in his chair. No, Mr. Coleman, you walked away from it the moment you decided to treat us like we didn't belong. Arthur felt his blood boiling. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to curse them, to fight back. He wanted to take his restaurant and his reputation and prove to the world that he was still in control. But he wasn't. Jonathan wasn't just offering him a deal. He was giving him an ultimatum. Sign the contract, take the money, and disappear. Or refuse and have his name dragged through every newspaper in London. Arthur's eyes darted to the newspaper on the table. Racial discrimination allegations at London's most exclusive restaurant. The scandal had already begun. If he refused, Jonathan and Sophia would make sure the full story was exposed. The unfair treatment, the way he humiliated them, the cold, hard truth about what La Maison d'Or had really stood for under his control. And if that happened, no one would ever eat at his restaurants again. No investor would ever touch his name. Nibway. He would be finished. Arthur felt his stomach twist. They had beaten him completely. With shaking hands, he picked up the pen. Fine, he spat. I'll sign. Jonathan simply nodded as if he had expected nothing less. Sophia slid the contract forward. Good choice. Arthur scribbled his name onto the document, his fingers gripping the pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. And just like that, he lost his empire. The end of an era. The moment the ink dried, Jonathan and Sophia stood up, ready to leave. Paused just before exiting, giving Arthur one last look. Le Maison d'Or will finally become what it should have been all along, an establishment where excellence, not exclusion, defines its legacy. You could have been part of that, but instead you chose to make yourself obsolete. Arthur didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply sat there, staring at the contract, staring at his own downfall. He had built Le Maison d'Or as a fortress of exclusivity. Now he wasn't even allowed inside. The public backlash, within days, exploded. The news exploded. Arthur Coleman, disgraced restaurateur, sells Le Maison d'Or amid racial discrimination scandal. Luxury restaurant empire collapses as longtime owner faces backlash. The public turned against him swiftly, and former employees came forward with stories of toxic management. Customers shared experiences of being turned away for not fitting the image. Food critics re-examined his restaurants, calling them outdated relics of a dying era. Arthur Coleman wasn't just losing his restaurant. He was being erased from the industry altogether. His name became a stain, a cautionary tale. No one wanted to associate with him. No investor wanted to touch him. He had spent his life curating an illusion of superiority, and now the world saw him for what he really was: small, bitter, and irrelevant. A new beginning for Le Maison d'Or. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Sophia Carter took ownership of Le Maison d'Or. They rebranded it, not just in name, but in philosophy. It became a place that truly celebrated excellence without exclusion. A place where sophistication and diversity coexisted. And as the grand reopening night approached, the guest list filled with leaders, innovators, and dreamers from every walk of life. Le Maison d'Or was no longer a symbol of elitism. It was a beacon of what true success looked like. And as for Arthur, no one missed him. Under Jonathan and Sophia Carter's ownership, Le Maison d'Or became something greater than it had ever been. Gone were the days of exclusivity based on prejudice. Now the restaurant thrived as a beacon of refinement and inclusivity. It was no longer about status, but about excellence, a place where people of all backgrounds, races, and cultures were welcome. And ironically, under their leadership, Le Maison d'Or became more successful than Arthur Coleman had ever managed to make it. The restaurant's reservations were booked out for months. Celebrities, business moguls, and global dignitaries became regular patrons. Food critics hailed the transformation as one of the greatest revivals in modern fine dining. The secret to their success? Jonathan and Sophia built an empire on merit, not exclusion. They hired top culinary talent regardless of background. They introduced a menu that celebrated diversity, world-class French cuisine with global influences. They treated every guest with the same level of respect, whether they were billionaires or young professionals celebrating their first big promotion. And the world took notice. Within just a year, Le Maison d'Or was more prestigious than ever before. Michelin stars, luxury partnerships, and expansion into international markets. It had become a cultural landmark, a global phenomenon. And through it all, one name was never mentioned. Arthur Coleman. Arthur still had money. The sale of his restaurant had left him with more than enough to retire in luxury. But what he had underestimated was how much he needed his reputation. The wealthy circles that once welcomed him with open arms now avoided him. His name had become synonymous with elitism, discrimination, and outdated thinking. Former friends no longer invited him to social gatherings. Investors refused to take his calls. No one wanted to be associated with the man who lost his restaurant to a discrimination scandal. His name was poison in the industry. And as his other business ventures struggled, Arthur realized a painful truth. Without Le Maison d'Or, he was nothing. A taste of his own medicine. One evening, as Arthur sat alone in his penthouse suite, sipping a glass of whiskey, he made a decision. He would return to Le Maison d'Or, not as a guest. Perhaps if he showed his face, if he dined there, people would begin to forget. Maybe he could mend his reputation. Maybe he could still reclaim a shred of his former prestige. So, for the first time in years, Arthur picked up the phone and called for a reservation. La Maison d'Or, how may I assist you? Arthur cleared his throat, straightening his posture as if the receptionist could see him. Yes, I'd like a table for this Saturday evening. Arthur Coleman. There was a pause. Too long of a pause. And then the receptionist spoke again, her voice perfectly polite but devoid of warmth. I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman, but we are fully booked for the foreseeable future. Arthur stiffened. Surely you can make an exception. I am well acquainted with the establishment. Another. I understand, sir, but unfortunately we have no availability. Is there anything else I can assist you with? Arthur's grip tightened on the phone. For years, he had been the one deciding who was worthy of a table at La Maison d'Or. He had dictated who was welcome and who was turned away. Now the doors were closed to him. And the worst part? It wasn't personal. They simply didn't need him. La Maison d'Or had outgrown him. It had become something greater than he ever allowed it to be. Arthur let out a breath, defeated. No, nothing else. Have a wonderful evening, Mr. Coleman. Click. The end of an era. That night, Arthur sat alone in his vast empty apartment, staring at the city skyline. His name meant nothing now. His influence had faded. His empire was gone. He was a relic of the past, a man out of time, forgotten by the very world he once thought he ruled. And as the city moved on without him, as the restaurant he once controlled thrived without his presence, Arthur finally understood. He hadn't just lost a restaurant, he had lost his place in the world, and no amount of money could ever buy it back. The story of Arthur Coleman and La Maison d'Or is more than just a tale of arrogance and downfall. It is a powerful reminder about reputation, power, and what truly defines success. Many people spend their entire lives building wealth, influence, and prestige, but they forget that what sustains all of that is not money, but how they treat others. Arthur Coleman made one fatal mistake. He believed he was untouchable, that status and exclusivity were the only things that mattered. But he failed to remember one simple truth. Power shifts, but a person's character is their true legacy. One, power is never permanent. Arthur once decided who was worthy of stepping into La Maison d'Or. He controlled access, dictated status, and enforced exclusivity. But the moment he lost power, no one cared about him anymore. He became irrelevant, forgotten by the very elite he once sought to impress. The lesson? Respect cannot be bought. If your influence is built on control and fear, the moment you lose that power, you lose everything. 2. Reputation is fragile. Arthur spent decades crafting an image of superiority. He assumed his name would always command respect. Yet, after a single scandal, his reputation was destroyed. No investors, no allies, no second chances. The lesson? Reputation is like a sandcastle. If it's not built on integrity, it crumbles at the first big wave. True success isn't about being feared, it's about being trusted. 3. True success comes from how you treat others. Jonathan and Sophia proved a simple but powerful truth. The best businesses don't thrive by excluding people. They thrive by welcoming the right ones. Success isn't about keeping power. It's about sharing it with those who deserve it. By embracing excellence over exclusion, they built something far greater than Arthur ever could. The lesson? At the end of the day, people won't remember how much money you had. They will remember how you treated them. Wealth fades, reputation can be lost, but kindness and integrity will always stand the test of time.